This program is a video presentation via Zoom of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Founded in 1951, the Roundtable hosts monthly presentations at a location near Washington, D.C., more recently at the Fort Myer Officers Club. For more information, go to www.cwrtdc.org.
I am delighted to introduce to our group tonight, Marion R. Cohen. I had the pleasure of meeting her during the tour that Jim Anderson arranged on the anniversary of the Battle of Ball's Bluff. As is often the case, I learned about our country's history that I had no idea about, which emphasizes that the more we learn about how much we have to learn. And we have the benefit tonight to hear from someone who has spent many years working in the field of education. Marion Cohen currently holds the position of Campus Executive Director for the Aviation Institute of Maintenance in Manassas, Virginia, where she oversees 200 students and 35 instructors and staff members. The Institute trains men and women to develop technical skills in high demand and in short supply in the aviation, manufacturing, welding, energy, and other industries. So she's helping those students develop those technical skills. Marion has not only spent many years in the field of education, but also in management, research, analysis, and public history and speaking. And her work in history spans over several decades and includes assignments for Congressman Gerald Connolly's Civil Rights Archives, the Monticello Historical Site, and other historical venues. In 2009, Marion was admitted to UVA and received her undergraduate degree in humanities, graduating with the highest distinction. She also holds a Master of Arts from George Mason University in African American Studies, and she was enrolled in the PhD program, I'm assuming at George Mason University too.
Yes.
Marion's field of interest, which you will hear more about tonight, is exploring the area of Reconstruction, where free persons purchased land, created schools and places of worship in an effort to obtain financial stability, education, and religious freedom. She also seeks to provide insight into 18th and 19th century Virginia and presents African-American historical narratives to schools, universities, civic organizations, private societies, conferences, and museums. Marion is also a regular interpreter at Monticello and venues in and around Fairfax County, including the Blenheim House that I mentioned earlier, and in Prince William County, including Manassas Battlefield. She is currently working on a manuscript, and this is going to be exciting to see. She's currently working on a manuscript of her memoirs on the hardships of a mixed woman of color living in segregated Northern Virginia. In addition, she is working on a book on Reconstruction, on the Reconstruction community building for freedmen in Northern Virginia through land ownership, education, and churches. For more information about Marion and her mission, visit marionhistorian.com. Again, it is my great pleasure to welcome Marion Cohen. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Civil War Roundtable and Kurt for inviting me to present something that's very important to me and my work, and actually my family, because I am a 7th generation Fairfax County resident, born and raised in a small place called Maryfield, if any of you all know where that is, and have lived my life really listening to the stories of my ancestors, and then going to higher education and studying various topics, Reconstruction, African American slavery, so on and so forth. So I am honored that I'm going to present to you some of the things that I found out about my family that's very important, because my work, I basically say, is I try to give voice to those who had no voice. So if you look at the top of the screen, the opening statement is the Confederate Impressment of Free Negroes, 1861, Centerville, Virginia. This picture really talks about what we will be talking about in this conversation. In the picture, you can see a very battle-worn landscape. You can see entrenchments. You can see logs that were Quaker guns. You can see in the background there are cabins that were used by the Confederacy for their winter encampment from October 1861 to March of 1862. And I say to you to look at this picture because who do you think dug those entrenchments? Who do you think helped build those earthworks? Who do you think helped build those cabins so the Confederate Army could be warm and toasty for the winter months? Well, one area that probably most people have not explored is the requisition for public use. So in July of 1861, the Virginia State Convention approved a ordinance that said the Confederacy had the right to have any free African American or enslaved to be brought into what they call public service to support the Confederacy. If you see the picture here, this picture depicts those African Americans. I don't know if they were enslaved or they were free, but it depicts the African American men that were, some of them that were chosen to be part of this public service from this ordinance that was created in July of 1861. So what was in the ordinance is if a commanding officer from the Confederate Army needed services from free African Americans or enslaved, they would go to the local board. So let's say they went to the local white citizenship of Fauquier County or Fairfax County, and they would say, you know, we need some free Negroes, male Negroes, or we need some enslaved folks. And let me just preface this by saying I will be using several vernaculars in this discussion. I will be using free Negroes, I will be using African Americans, and I will be using colored. And it will be based on the context of what we're talking about at that time. So in this ordinance, it says, such number of laborers as in their judgment may be proper and expedient. So the local sheriff, having a list given to him by the prominent white males in the community, would take that list and go into the African American communities and say, you, sir, have been chosen for, quote, public service. And if you don't go and do your public service, it is the equivalent of a Confederate or white male who has been drafted into militia, who failed to report to the militia and the hardships that they would encounter for not reporting. So the primary responsibility would be to erect batteries, entrenchments, or other necessities of the military service. So the picture you see here depicts the military service, the Confederacy having some free Negroes and possibly enslaved folks digging entrenchments and doing the things as a support unit for the Confederacy. But the one thing I want you to think about is when you think about the free Negroes and the enslaved community doing these things, you must remember the majority of them are doing this under harassment or under force because of this ordinance. If you don't do it, then you could be subject to any punishment that the Confederacy deemed necessary. So it wasn't a opportunity to choose. It was an opportunity, you're going to go do this or else. I wanted to show this map because it will help to explain some of the areas that we're going to be talking about. And there are 3 to 4 specific areas that I'll be talking about tonight. This particular map is a hand-drawn map made in about 1863. If you see the red arrow, this will give you some context of the area that I'm talking about. The red arrow is pointing to Stone Bridge. And I'm sure that all of the Civil War folks out there know about the Stone Bridge. After the first Battle of Manassas or Bull Run, whichever way you call it, the Stone Bridge wasn't a place of exit as the Union forces were pushed back into Centerville and into Washington, D.C. It also became a very clogged area because the citizens of Washington, D.C. in the area decided they wanted to bring picnic lunches out to Bull Run and watch the battle. So everybody's trying to get through this narrow stone bridge to get away from the Confederacy. And they're going up the road to Centerville. And so if you see at the top of the map, you see a drawing of Centerville. And you'll also see words that says Old Rebel Fort, that to the left and to the right, you'll see Old Fort. So these were forts that the Confederate Army built in 1861 that has a special association with my family and my family's history. Defense of Centerville, Virginia. So this is a etching of Centerville, Virginia. And Centerville is probably about 30 miles from Manassas battlefield, going towards Washington, D.C. Centerville is a really interesting plot of land because the elevation is really high and it gives a good view into the surrounding valleys in Northern Virginia. So this was prime real estate for the Confederacy and the Union, because that area kind of went back and forth, to have earthworks, to have entrenchments, to have winter encampments. So if you look at this picture, and most of my pictures or documents have been cited. This one was from the National Archives. I didn't put the citing down at the bottom, but if you would like that, certainly contact me and I can get that for you. But if you look into the center of the etching to your left, you'll see where it says General Lee's headquarters. And then there are several areas where it says fort, and they've got lines drawn, and they've also got cabins for winter encampments. So this gives you a pretty good feel for what the battlefield would have looked like if, say, an African American or an enslaved person were coming to help dig entrenchments or dig or do the things that needed to be done in the public works or public service of the Confederacy. So this is the main focus of my talk. This gentleman is James E. Lee. James E. Lee was my great-great-grandfather. And he was born in 1840 in a place called Della Plain, Virginia. So Della Plain is about 30 miles from Manassas battlefield. Manassas battlefield is about 3 miles to 5 miles from Centerville. I made a mistake with the distancing before. So James Lee is living in the rural part of the Shenandoah Valley in Della Plain. The interesting thing about James Lee is that he is born free. He is not enslaved. He is born free. So I know that James Lee was living in Della Plain. One reason is when the war broke out, the white male citizenry wanted to keep a list of where all the free Negroes were in the area. During enslavement and the slavery time period, whites were very fearful of African Americans who were free Negroes. They were fearful that they were going to start rebellions or start to corrupt their enslaved folks, to make their enslaved folks want to obtain their freedom. So having to write a list of where free Negroes were and what part of the county they're living in for whites was very important, because then they could keep an eye on them. Were they going to help the Union? Were they going to, do anything to offset what the Confederacy needed to do? So this was almost like a protection to have this type of list. And it wasn't just in Della Plain. Other places had these type of lists also. So the red arrow at the top gives us the date. It's 1861, free Negroes, Fauquier County, Virginia. If you notice, the red arrow in the middle says Charles W. Lee and James E. Lee. James E. Lee, my great-great-grandfather. The other arrow says that they are living on the property of A.J. Chung. So Andrew, or A.J. Chung, as he was called, was a wealthy planter in Della. He had a farm, had about $30,000 worth of real estate, was very prominent, and his grave is still in Della. It's in a small family cemetery on church grounds. So we went out one day and took a picture of this for this archive. So if you remember, in the beginning, when I talked about the impressment of free African Americans and the ordinance that came along with that, when the Confederacy passed the law in July of 1861 for public service, this document that I found at the African American Historical Association in the Plains, Virginia, really encompasses what that ordinance said. If you look at the arrow at the top, the date of this document, this handwritten document, is October 13th, 1861. The writer of this document is writing on behalf of General Johnston, and he is Lieutenant Colonel Williamson, Chief Engineer of the Potomac Department. And he's writing to a prominent citizen, white citizen, in Della, Virginia. He's writing to John Beckham, who is a wealthy planter and also is a lawyer. So this letter says to Mr. Beckham that we are in need of more free African Americans, and we want you to have the marshal go and get these free Negroes and bring them to Centerville to help us or assist us in building entrenchments against the invading army. So if you look at this document, and the contents of it really supports how this ordinance of public service was used. On the attached to this document was a handwritten list of African Americans who are living in Della that would be considered to be taken to Centerville and dig entrenchments for the Confederacy. And if you look at line 33, where the star is, you will see the name of James Lee. So this is a typed version of this letter, so we don't miss any of the content. So to John Beckham, Esquire, Manassas, October 13th, 1861. Dear sir, I have been directed by General Johnston to call out 400 or 500 free Negroes to make entrenchments at once against the invading army. I thought of you at once in this hour of peril to our country, and I hereby appoint you to call on the sheriff for as many as you can get and bring them to Centerville as soon as you can. Do, my dear sir, accept this appointment and come, help us. We are in great need of the very help you can give us. Be prompt and come forward. Be careful to examine each Negro and see that he is not diseased, otherwise useless. Let him bring shoes, clothing, blanket. The old hands we had at Rappahannock Station and at Evansport are already instructed and would be very useful at this time. I send you herewith a list of their names. They might be called out again for a short time of service and would be so much more efficient than raw hands. Your compensation will be any reasonable charge you think proper to make and subject to the approval of the general. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Thomas H. Williams, Senior Lieutenant Colonel, Chief Engineer, Potomac Department. So this is the typed version of that list. You will see that number 33 is James Lee. The thing that I thought was interesting about this document is where the letter says the old hands we had at Rappahannock Station and at Evansport are already instructed and would be very useful at this time. So the first part of the letter is saying, we want to get these free Negroes to come and help build entrenchments in Centerville. but we want to use the ones that we use for the Rappahannock Station and Evansport. So Evansport, my understanding is it was sort of near Occoquan and Quantico Marine Base. So the entrenchments were from Quantico through Dumfries all the way up into Manassas and through Centerville. So this is a very long network of entrenchments, forts, and earthworks. So James Lee is on this list. So it seems that he also was part of the Rappahannock Station and the Evansport construction of any entrenchments or any public service that needed to be done for the Confederacy. This is a picture of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas H. Williamson. He's the one that wrote the letter. He is requesting for these 500 free Negroes. He was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel in 1861 with the Corps of Engineers. He was part of the defense of the Rappahannock River and Manassas. The other person involved in this letter was John G. Beckham, who was the attorney. He's 53 years old and a farmer. This document is an 1860 census from Fauquier County. And if you see the two red lines, the first one going down shows the amount of real estate Mr. Beckham owned, which was over $32,000. And the value of his personal property was over $10,000. So this coincides with the ordinance that I read earlier, that a commander would go to the leading white male citizenry and get them to get a list of Negroes or free persons of color and give that list to the sheriff. And the sheriff would then go get the free Negroes, like my grandfather, great-great-grandfather, and then tell them or take them to wherever they needed to go to support the Confederacy. This map really shows the areas that we're talking about. So the four areas that are important are the Della Plain, Virginia, Manassas, Virginia, Centerville, and Falls Church. Now, current day times, you can take a road straight from Della Plain all the way into Washington, D.C. But, you know, our roads are a little bit better than the roads that they had back then. But the map here in the center, the pink portion, is representative of Fauquier County. And in the top of this pink area is where Della Plain is. If you go down to the next star, where you see Manassas, that is the Prince William County area. And right above Manassas in that star, there's a little teeny bit of pink that's kind of coming out. Going that way is where you would run into Centerville. So it's relatively close. Della Plain, like I said, is about 30 miles to Manassas Junction. And Della Plain to Centerville is about 32 miles. Between Manassas Junction and Centerville, you know, a couple of miles. I put in here Della Plain to Falls Church because the ending point for my great-great-grandfather was Falls Church, Virginia, which, for those who don't know, is a suburb of Washington, D.C. That's about 7 to 10 miles from the border of Washington, D.C. So let's talk about my African-American heritage and my patriarch, James E. Lee. So to talk about this heritage, we first have to go back to 1800, when James Lee's grandmother was born. She's my fourth G grandmother, but it was James Lee's grandmother. Her name was Lucy Lee, and she was born free. Lucy Lee, in 1823, had a daughter named Betsy Lee, and she was born free. James Lee was born by Betsy Lee in 1840, and he was born free. Next, 1874, Arthur Lee, my great-grandfather. Then he had Avon Lee, my grandfather. And then in 1922, my mother, Eulalia Lee Ransell, was born, and then hence you have me. So we talk about born free. So born free, what does that mean? Well, if you were born free, and I'll talk a little bit about what born free means, but if you were considered free, either through manumission, meaning that you obtained your freedom through legal processes, or you were born free, you really weren't free in the state of Virginia, because the law said you still couldn't learn to read and write. The law said you couldn't hold any firearms. You're definitely going to live in the same place where white folks know you are free. The reason is, in 1793, when the Virginia state legislature ruled free Negroes and mulattoes shall be registered and numbered in a book to be kept by the town clerk, which shall specify age, name, color, status, and by whom and in what court emancipated. So the process was, if you were either given manumission through legal courts, or you were born free, every 3 years in the state of Virginia, you had to go to your local courthouse and you would petition to get your free papers. If you look at this document that I have here, this is a copy of James Lee's brother's free papers, Charles Lee. Charles Lee got these free papers when his mother registered him at the Fauquier County Courthouse in 1840. His mother, because Charles was young, would have to make sure she kept these free papers, because if she was ever challenged and she could not prove that her son or she were not free, they could be arrested and they could be put in the jail and then subsequently sold into slavery. And in Virginia, if you were sold into slavery, you were going to be sold down south, because that's where the need for labor was. And the conditions of enslavement in the deep south, you had about a 10-year longevity once you started working wherever in the deep south, excuse me. So I don't know if any of you ever saw 12 Years a Slave. And in 12 Years a Slave, which is a true story, this free person of color, Samuel, he loses, or his free papers are taken from him, and he's jailed and then sold into slavery. So these things happen. So keeping these papers and getting these papers were very important for people who were either born free or given manumission. I am one that loves to walk in the footprints of history, especially those footprints that are related to me. So if you look at this historical marker in the top right of this photo, you will see that this is a historical marker that is letting you know that this is the area of the Fauquier County Courthouse. And the Fauquier County Courthouse was in Fauquier County in the county of Warrenton. It was built in 1760, and so it's been there for forever. And it would have been where James Lee, Betsy Lee, Lucy Lee, that 3 generations of Lees would have gone from Della Plain to the Fauquier County Courthouse. It's probably about 20 miles, and registered themselves as born free Negroes. And they would have been given their free papers. Again, how do I know Lucy Lee was born free? Well, when you would go to the courthouse, the town clerk would have a book specifically called the Free Negro Registry. And in that registry, they would put the person's name down. Like we have Lucy Lee, about 40 years old. It would say how tall she was. Here it says dark mulatto woman. For those who don't know what mulatto means mixed race. Mulatto can also mean one who can pass for white. It was a way of defining a person, especially if they needed to find this person for some reason or other. putting down that they had a scar or they were dark mulatto, woman, those kind of things were very helpful. The most important part of this is how free. She was born free. Lucy Lee in 1860, on the 1860 census, she was a remarkable woman because not only was she born free in 1800, but in the census, she is listed as having both of her grandsons there with her. She's a farmhand that owns $100 worth of real estate and $50 worth of personal property tax. Now, looking through the historical documents, when I first saw this, I'm like, okay, so she's born free. That's wild. Then she has real estate as a Black woman in this time period owning real estate. I mean, how did this all come about? I'll tell you how that all came about. And having the background of this will go into the talk about the entrenchments and the public service impressment of free African American. Here again, Betsy Lee was born free, 1823. She's James Lee's mother. So at the top is Betsy Ann Lee, has her description. She's born free. Her brother, Squire Lee, born free. James Jackson Lee, born free. Because all of these siblings had a mother, Lucy Lee, who was born free. Same thing with James Lee. James Lee, he's 5 months old. He has no visible scars, which is good. I was glad to see that a 5-month-old did not have any visible scars. So that was good. And he's born free. His brother, Charles, is 2 years old, and he's also born free because his mother, Betsy, is born free. This born free or emancipation or who's a slave or who isn't really started in 1662 with the Slave Code of Virginia. I only have one code on here, but the slave codes were many. And the codes were laws and ordinances on how African Americans would be treated. Would they be, in 1660, Virginia passed a law that said any person that came to Virginia by sea or by land who was not a Christian would be enslaved for life. In 1662, Virginia enacts a law of hereditary slavery, meaning that a child born to an enslaved mother inherits her slave status. If the mother is free, her children are free. If the mother's enslaved, the children are enslaved. So you can see, because of this law or ordinance, Lucy Lee, Betsy Lee, and James Lee are all free because their mother before them was free. So with this ordinance, it's this lasted until the end of the Civil War and emancipation. So that is how they determined the status. This picture here is a picture of a slave ship taking slaves down to the belly of the ship for the Middle Passage crossing. Like I said, I love to go in and walk the footprints of my ancestors and historical figures. And going to the Fauquier County Courthouse was no different. Because when I went to the courthouse complex, near the courthouse was this interesting L-shaped stone. And the ledger here says that it was a slave auction block. That's the ledger that I have in the middle of the page here. The picture on the left-hand side, I was immediately drawn to this rock. I had to touch it. I had to feel it. And when I did, I felt like my ancestors' spirits were saying, thank you for giving us voice. Thank you for recognizing the toil that we had to go through. And I also thought about my ancestors are passing this rock because of a piece of paper. And someone else's ancestors are being sold as property. And just the juxtaposition of that was very, very moving for me. And if you look, there seems to be in this picture on the left, almost like sunbeams and a haze going through the photo. But then the photo on the right is very clear. It was taken on the same day, one picture right after the other. So I don't know what that was. I assumed that it was my ancestors joining me when I touched the stone. So the slave auction block ledger says early 20th century photos show a large angular stone laying at the corner of Main Street and Alexandria Pike, Warrenton. According to local legend, the naturally formed ancient stone was found in Carter's Run and served as a mounting block for carriages and horses and as a slave auction block in the days before the war between the states. So we're talking about Fauquier County, which is the county that the Lee family are living in, were born in. In the 1860 census, Fauquier County was noted as having 21,000 people. 52% of those people were Black, and 821 of those Blacks were free. So within that 821 are my ancestors. The other interesting thing about Della Plain is there's a railroad that runs through there. In 1860, 1861, it was called the Piedmont Station. And it became very important to the first battle of Manassas. So I have pictures here. The picture on your left we took, and that's the backside of the original train station. It's still there. In the middle is the front side of the train station and the train tracks, same place they were in the war, and also a historical marker that tells Della Plain, formerly Piedmont Station. The last picture to your right is a picture of myself reading the tabletop of why this train depot and this train station was so important. This tabletop historical marker says here at Piedmont Station, now Della Plain, trains were used for the first time in history to move troops to impending battle. On July 19, 1861, the fields surrounding this stop on the Manassas Gap Railroad, which appeared then almost exactly as they do today, were filled with thousands of volunteer soldiers, members of General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate Army of the Shenandoah. A single steam locomotive was on hand to move the army to Manassas Junction, then threatened with federal attack. General Thomas J. Jackson, 1st Brigade, ordered here from their bivouac in the meadows just south of Paris, were loaded onto the freight and cattle cars for the first transport, which took 8 hours to cover the 30 miles to Manassas. So this train station was the first time that troops had been moved by locomotive. This train station is near where A.J. Chung's property was. This train station is near where James Lee lived. I can only surmise that not only was this train station used to transport troops of Joseph E. Johnston, but perhaps they transported the free Negroes that General Joseph E. Johnston had requested, and the letter that was written to the marshal in Fauquier County in Della Plain. So this train station, important to the Confederacy, is also part of my family history. It can tell the story of a young man who was impressed into public service to dig entrenchments for the Confederacy and really didn't have a choice whether he could do it or not. And he may have been on a train, undoubtedly in the back somewhere, going to the Manassas Centerville area. I apologize for my horsey throat. This is a picture of Della Plain in 1994. They used to have excursions that would go from Front Royal through the Shenandoah Valley area of Della Plain into Manassas. And you can see this is a steam locomotive. So you can only imagine what the steam locomotive and having many, many, many troops and other persons and personnel surrounding a locomotive waiting to get on the train for the 30-mile trek to Manassas. Requisition for public use was in existence from 1861 to 1864. And the result of those persons, those free African Americans, like my grandfather, who were put in public use, were brought to Centerville and dug entrenchments. The center black and white picture is of entrenchments built in Centerville. I don't know if these were the ones that my grandfather, great-great-grandfather built, but these were the type of entrenchments that you will find in the Centerville area. The interesting thing about Centerville in Fairfax County is they've identified areas that they consider historic Centerville Park. And in this area, they have a kiosk that's in front of land that they think was one of the winter encampments for the Confederacy in 1861. The arrow that's pointing to this kiosk is the same photo that I've made enlarged in the middle of the screen. So I encourage anyone who wants to learn more about entrenchments and how they looked or where they were located to go to this historic Centerville Park, and it can give you detail and you can walk around and absorb the area. Like I said, in historic Centerville, there are little pockets of areas for different things. The picture at the bottom left says Winter Quarters, Historic Centerville. Both the Confederate and the Union Army used this plot of area for winter encampments. And on the middle is another shot of me in front of that area. And the shot on the right is where I'm closer to the kiosk, which is a more flat, lower ground. The picture up top to your left are cabins erected for the 1861 winter encampment. And, you know, I got to think, were some of these free Negroes used for public service in creating many of these cabins? I don't know, but certainly if a commander wanted something done with this public service ordinance, they would have to do it or suffer the consequence. The picture on the right is the center of historic Centerville and how it looked in 1861, 62. The red star is next to what was then a hospital. What is a church and later became a hospital during the Civil War. And that church is still there. It's called the Stone Church. And it's an interesting landmark because trying to find these entrenchments and the historic portions of the winter quarters and so on and so forth in the entrenchments, using this stone church as the starting point was very helpful. One of the areas that we went to, which is very important to me, is the site of entrenchments that are right down the street from the Stone Church in the middle of a town center and townhouse development. There is a historical marker there, and the picture on the right is of myself standing on the top of the entrenchments, and the pictures below with the stars are the entrenchments looking down into the entrenchments, and then a earthen berm. The last picture to your left is another earthen berm. So this area has been preserved. They have a fence around it. They have a marker. It tells exactly what this was used for. So on the site, it says, in 1861, Confederate forces constructed the defense bunker in the winter of 1861. The bunker site was chosen due to the relatively high elevation of the Centerville area and its excellent vantage. Confederate forces held the bunker from the time of its construction until Union forces captured it in March of 1862. It remained under Union control until the end of the war. I would surmise that my grandfather probably, if not helped build this particular entrenchment, knew about it, maybe walked around it or near it. So it was very important for me to be able to go and walk in his footprints. Even though this, I would assume, is not something that he wanted to do, but is something that if he wanted to preserve his life, he had to do. And so the evidence of his work is still in existence, and folks can go and visit it anytime. I pulled this picture because to me, it's very striking. The top portion of the picture describes the living. You've got these cabins that soldiers are living in and trying to survive in. And then the bottom half are those who didn't survive. And I can surmise that in public service, one of the things that the freed African Americans would have to do is bury the dead of the Confederacy. I don't have any documentation that says my grandfather did it, but there again, if he was told to do it by a commander or someone in the Confederacy Army through public use or public service, he would have had to do what they asked. So I think that's a very, very powerful picture. Now, this photo is somewhere in Centerville. When I was visiting the areas, the historic sites, they don't have any graves, they don't have any markers. So I don't know if after the war, these folks were, taken up and moved to their family plots or whatever. But this picture truly shows graves and the winter quarters that were constructed. This is an aerial shot that I took from Google Earth. It'll give some perspective from today's narrative. If you look to your left, there is Route 66, which is a main artery that takes you directly to Washington, D.C. So you can go Della Plain through Centerville, straight through Falls Church into D.C. on this road. It's heavily traveled every day. Next to it is a housing development. And in this housing development of townhouses are where the earthworks and entrenchments are and the winter encampments. So if you look at the star that's to the bottom of the page on the left, that's where the area where this kiosk is. It's flatter land, and it's where the 1861 Confederate winter encampment was held. If you go up to the red star, that area is the other winter encampment that was a little bit elevated, that had the sign with the two caps on it. If you go further up top to the white star, that is indicative of the entrenchments that I was at, that I actually put footprints in, hopefully to follow my grandfather. So this picture hopefully gives you a sense of where we are today and where we were back then in 1861. If you remember, I talked about the old church and the middle of Centerville. So this is a kiosk near the old church that talks a little bit about historic Centerville. Here is where Warrenton Turnpike turned west from Braddock Road. The Union Army marched from Centerville to meet Confederate forces in the first great battle of the Civil War. That afternoon, Union soldiers passed by here again, fleeing from the Manassas battlefield to reach Washington, D.C. the next day. So the church that the picture on the bottom left, the Old Stone Church, was then used as a medical hospital. If you go up to the picture on the right side top, there again, that's winter quarters that was abandoned in March of 1862 by the Confederacy. So we talked about James Lee, my great-great-grandfather, but I also talked about his brother, Charles W. Lee. Charles Lee, I found enlisted in the 10th United States Colored Troop Infantry Company. I think it's G on this tombstone. Charles Lee served until the end of the war. And he and his brother left Della and went to Falls Church, which is relatively close to Washington, D.C. And there they helped build community. They helped build churches, schools, and they became prominent citizens. Charles Lee helped build Galloway Methodist Church and Falls Church, which is still in existence today. James Lee also helped build the church. So one of the reasons I think that James Lee and Charles left Della is because my cousin found this note from the archives at Fauquier County. It says, James Lee wishes to obtain title of possession of Howe's lot, which he and his brother bought of A.J. Chung in Fauquier County just before the war. Delayed for superintendent in that county, sent note to superintendent of Warrenton. So my summation is that James Lee and probably Charles put a petition in for land title or possession of this land that his grandmother had put as $100 worth of real estate on her 1860 census. I believe this land was still owned by A.J. Chung, but they had an agreement of some sort where Chung was going to sell the land to the Lees or whatever, but the war broke out. So this title to the land for the house and the land was never created. And so I surmise that that's why James Lee and Charles Lee went to look for better things closer to the center of power near Washington, D.C. Because when African Americans were freed, whether they were born free or they became free through manumission, after the war, they didn't want handouts. They wanted to be free. They wanted to own their own land. They wanted to grow their own crops. They wanted to be educated. They wanted to be able to vote. They wanted to be able to do everything that citizens of the United States, male citizens of the United States could do. And so that's why I think, again, James Lee and Charles probably moved out of that Shenandoah Valley, closer to DC, because there was probably more opportunities after the Civil War for them. Now, I know that James Lee came to Falls Church because in February of 1990, he dictated a narrative to the church clerk at Second Baptist Church in Falls Church. And this dictation says, his words, I made my first visit to Falls Church about 50 years ago, and I found things all torn to pieces. The railroad track was torn up and the tires were bent around trees. No church was open and the state of affairs was dreadful. So we all know that in the Civil War narratives, we read that the railway was disrupted by taking the tracks off and bending them around trees. And so here we have a narrative from my great-great-grandfather that said, he came to Falls Church and everything was dreadful. There was no church. There was railroad ties around trees. But I think that I know that he still found opportunity in Falls Church. I know that because there was a General John S. Crocker. General Crocker was born in New York. He entered the Union Army as a colonel. He was assigned to the Army of the Potomac and was a headquarters guard. He was captured in 1862. He took part in every battle of the Army of the Potomac. After the Battle of Spotsylvania, he became a brigadier general. In 1869, he became warden of the district jail. But the other thing that makes Crocker important to my story is that whites in Falls Church and whites in Northern Virginia did not want to sell land to African Americans. And remember, I said what I found is after the Civil War, that's what African Americans wanted. They wanted their own land to grow their own crops, own churches, schools, and just be able to become good citizens. So Crocker found an opportunity in this by purchasing land in and around Falls Church and then flipping it or selling it to African Americans who lived in that Fairfax County, Falls Church, Merrifield area. So I like to say that Crocker was the first land speculator. But it's a good thing he was because of his ability to buy land and then sell it. It allowed James Lee and his brother Charles to be able to buy land in North Carolina, in Falls Church, and then be able to begin the life that they sought to create. So James Lee, when he comes to Falls Church, he buys land, but he also helps to construct a African American Baptist church. It's called Second Baptist Church in Falls Church. He was one of the first trustees. He helped to raise money to buy the land to build the church. When the church was first built, it was a church and a school. One of the quotes I love when I look at religion and African Americans after the Civil War, they would say of their churches, we want bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh. Meaning we want an African American to be in the pulpit teaching us, someone that understands what we've gone through. We're not going to go to a white church and listen to someone say, we need to be good servants. And so that's what they did. They worked hard, they created churches and schools, and James Lee and his brother Charles were important in that part of Falls Church. Newly freed African Americans, once they obtained land, notedly would donate land for what they called Negro schools. And so James Lee was no different. In Falls Church, he donated land for the first Negro school in Falls Church. Now, that first school was replaced by this school, which is a frame school built in the 1920s. This area is near Annandale Road and Arlington Boulevard. So to look back at James Lee's life after the war in 1882, James Lee, his personal property tax that he declared, 2 horses, 2 cows, 3 hogs, a carriage, a clock, a sewing machine, and furniture. I mean, to me, that seems like he is becoming a prominent citizen. Our oral history says that James Lee used the horses in the carriage sort of like a taxi service, pick up people, take them where they needed to go, or if they wanted to go for a carriage ride or something like that. I found it interesting too that he had a clock so he could tell time, and that he had a sewing machine for his wife. So I assumed that they probably had enough clothing because she would be able to use a sewing machine. So James Lee was born in 1840, and that's because his mother was born free. In 1860, James' grandmother said she owned $100 in property. In 1861, James lived in Della Plain on Andrew A.J. Chung's property. 1861, in October, James digs entrenchments for the Confederacy. In 1866, James and his brother Charles come to Falls Church, and in 1867, they purchased 12 acres in Falls Church. They started out with 8 and then increased it to 12. In 1872, James became first trustee of the Second Baptist Church, Falls Church, Virginia, and James E. Lee provided property for the first colored school. James Lee died in 1923, and he's buried in Second Baptist Church Cemetery. But in the 30s, his heirs donated land for the James Lee Elementary School, which is now James Lee Community Center. And there again, that's a picture of my great-great-grandfather. So James and Charles purchased 8 acres in 1867 from Crocker. The cost was anywhere from $32 to $35 per acre. Crocker paid about $10 per acre. But by August of 1869, they paid the loan off. 1870 census, there's about 120 Blacks that own land in Fairfax County, which also includes that Centerville area. The Lee brothers sold produce They grew produce and they sold produce to Falls Church residents. And they also would take their horse and wagon to Washington, D.C., and they would sell at the Liberty Street Market. And there was a historian in 1963 that wrote a book all about Falls Church and its citizens. And it's called Fence and Fireside. And in that book, Mr. Stedman said, Mr. Lee was one of the most prosperous of citizens and farmers in Falls Church. He had 12 children who lived near each other and were solid citizens of great influence in the town. So this is the James Lee Elementary School that the heirs of James Lee, his sons, donated land for it to be built. It was built of solid brick. It opened in 1948. It was closed in 1965, 66 due to segregation, and it was repurposed and now is a community center. The legacy of James Lee is his sons. The one on the left is Garfield Lee. Garfield Lee was the last of 12 children. They actually had more than 12 because some died at birth. But I actually got to meet Garfield Lee, which, I mean, I was young and I didn't really understand the significance of being able to meet Garfield Lee, whose father was James Lee, who dug entrenchments for the Confederacy. Garfield Lee left this area as a young man, and he went to California, and he created a catering business, and he catered to the stars. One of his prominent persons was Diana Ross and others from Motown. And so he had a very prosperous business in California. This is Arthur Lee, which is my great-grandfather. He was one of the earlier children, and this is an early picture of him. And Garfield is a later, he's in his senior year. This is my grandfather, Avon B. Lee. Avon and my grandmother lived on a farm in Fairfax County. And this is one of the sadder stories of my family's history. They lived in a place called the Pines because there were so many pine trees in this area. And for those of you who know where Fairfax Hospital is, their 20-acre farm was right behind the hospital. And in 1965, 66, because of segregation, the white school board, because there's no African Americans on the board, came to all the people in the Pines that own land, which was a Black community. And they said, you have 90 days to get out, or we're going to take your property for eminent domain because we're going to build a school. I understand, James Lee left Avon Lee money. He owned the land outright. They didn't have a mortgage. And so here my grandparents, Avon Lee, is in his 60s, and he's uprooted because Fairfax County wants to build a high school. The sad part about it, they never built the high school. They took the land. It lay dormant for 20 years. Then they decided to give it to the Parks and Recreation. And the Parks and Recreation created soccer fields. So my grandmother would drive past her property, and my grandfather drive past their property, which was instilled in them from James Lee, that you keep property. That's what makes you a citizen, knowing that eminent domain basically took their land and was never used for the purpose that it was obtained. I like to put this slide in here because Luther Porter Jackson was a prominent African-American historian, and he wrote a book in 1939, Free Negro Labor and Property Holding in Virginia. And it really does support a lot of the things that I have said in this PowerPoint. One of the paragraphs is the free Negro in Virginia, as in other states, was largely a product of the American Revolution, with its emphasis on the natural rights of man. This doctrine led to a wholesale manumission of slaves, thereby creating the free Negro class. Virginia had 12,000 plus free Negroes in 1790, 30 plus in 1810, 47 in 1830, 58 plus in 1860. Now I read that paragraph because if you remember, James Lee was born free because his mother in 1823 was born free. She was born free because her mother, Lucy, was born free in 1800. So the only way that Lucy could be born free in 1800 was if her mother somehow became free. Do I think Lucy Lee's mother before 1800 was born free? No. I think Lucy Lee's mother was caught up in the natural rights of man and the aftermath of the American Revolution, which some slave owners had the epiphany that holding people in bondage was not the right thing. One of those persons was Robert Carter, who was one of the larger landowners in Virginia. And after the Revolutionary War, which would have been the time frame of when Lucy Lee's mother would have been of childbearing age, he gave manumission to over 400 slaves, all of his slaves. He gave them manumission. I'm thinking that my ancestor, Lucy Lee, her mother was part of this manumitted slaves from Robert Carter. It's the largest manumission of any slaveholder in the country. And I think that my family is linked to that. And that's how we then create 4 to 3 generations of free people of color. You know, my story is very eclectic, to say the least. It goes from one corner to the next. I grew up as an African American in segregated Fairfax County, Northern Virginia, thinking that I was an African American woman. But I later learned through being a historian and researching that my biological father was Raymond E. Smith. He was a white man. And so you could call me a mulatto, right? Because I'm a mixed woman of color. I like to tell people, you know, I went to bed one night as a African American and woke up the next day finding out I was a mixed woman of color. Not only did I find out I was a mixed woman of color, but through my genealogical research, I have found that my ancestry on my white side started in British North America around 1632 through Plymouth Bay Colony in Barnstaple, Massachusetts. And the people that came here to the Plymouth Bay Colony came from a portion of England. I can't remember now. I want to say Devon. It was Devon, England. So I've really traced that family root back. My husband and I, again, took a trip to Boston, and I wanted to walk in the footprints of my ancestors. And I'm looking here or standing next to the bay and thinking, you know, I have 2 sets of families. One set came here on the shores of Jamestown through the Middle Passage in chains. And the other one came on the shores of Plymouth Bay Colony by choice. So it's 2 stories and 2 different shores. But they came here to British North America. And through this amalgamation of history and land and so on and so forth, I have this amazing story that I tell people that stems from, you know, Jamestown to Plymouth Bay Colony. I have been doing living history and historical research well into 1990, 1991. The bottom picture on the left-hand side, I am cooking in Poplar Forest, which was Thomas Jefferson's summer home. But I also cook at Monticello. And just to note, I get very dirty cooking to the point where I take my clothes off in the garage when I get home instead of going in the house because I smell like smoke and I've got soot. And I mean, I take it to the limit. So I'm very proud of the work that I do to teach young folks the life of the enslaved community and what they had to go through. The middle picture, I was on Bob Johnson's show that he had on Channel 9 it was about finding your relatives. And he was interviewing me about finding my biological father. The other photo next to that is I am on WHUR, a local radio station, talking about history and African-American concerns and history and so on and so forth. The top picture that says County of Fairfax. On Saturday, I did a television show for the Fairfax County History Commission, their conference, and it was all about family. I am very proud of the work that I did for Congressman Gerald Connolly. And that is the picture where I'm standing at the podium on your right. Congressman Connolly hired me to go into the community. One reason is because I'm seventh generation, and talk to those people who were either affected by segregation or worked in the civil rights movement. And I got 50 videotapes from all walks of life for that time period. And this picture is of us, or me, giving the keynote address about my work. And eventually we handed the videotapes over to George Mason. They are the repository for the Library of Congress for this particular project. And some of the videos are on the George Mason Folk Life website. If anyone's interested, I can certainly give you the link so you can listen to some of those. So as I said, I've been doing this a long time. It's not work to me. That they say if you do something you love, it's not work. It's not work. I could eat and breathe research and talking and learning new things. And so I have a website, marionhistorian.com. I figured that was easy to remember. This picture is of me. It is my 18th century clothing I wear to Monticello. And I'm holding my broad hoe because during that time period, the enslaved community, that would have been the tool that they used to cultivate the ground, to grow the crops. And it's almost a symbol of who I am, working hard and trying to bring a voice to those who had no voice. And so hopefully tonight, you've allowed me to do that. I hope that you've learned something. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Marion, that was just absolutely fascinating. We have quite a few questions. We'll get through some of those, but I wanted to thank you so much. As I mentioned at the outset, I learned so much briefly when I met you at the Balls Bluff tour, and I was just excited to hear more about the story you had to tell. Thank you very much for a very interesting program. One quick question I have before we get into the questions is the ordinance that you mentioned at the outset of your presentation. I wasn't, at first, before tonight, I thought that ordinance was directed to any citizens, but that one was directed specifically to free African Americans.
Yes.
And were there similar ordinances for other residences? I mean, was this appropriate and whatever the language was, proper and expedient? Was that applied to non-white citizens in Virginia, or was it only for free people?
I have not really researched that part of it, so I don't know. I really couldn't answer that question. Yeah, like I said, my research has been within the African American community, so I'm not real sure, if it was expanded to encompass.
That would be telling if that was an ordinance that was established and adopted specifically to apply to free persons, and there were no similar ordinances for others.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Dickinson started off with some questions. Bill, if you want to open your mic and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, my question was whether or not the enslaved people or the masters of the enslaved or the freemen were compensated. And if so, was it comparable to what the compensation was to Civil War soldiers, even though they were probably paid in worthless Confederate currency?
Well, if the enslaved were impressed to do work, certainly the money would go to the owner. And that would have
Right.
been in any instance. In January was a time when slaves were rented out or hired out. And if they were hired out, the master got the money, not the enslaved person. It does say that the free African Americans will be compensated at the rate of the white soldier. I've not found any records that show that they got paid, but they could have. I'm not sure. But even if they weren't getting paid, they were going to do it anyway because they feared, that the consequences of saying no. I'm not going to do this.
Well, that segues perfectly to the question John Anderson asked. He asked whether once impressed to perform manual labor, were free people treated the same as slaves.
Free people of color, basically, the freedom that they had was they could live where they wanted to. They weren't living off of rations because the enslaved community were given rations per week per slave, which would be a pound of fat back, which is the fat part of the hog, and 4 cups of cornmeal, maybe some whiskey or rum or something like that. But the free person of color would be able to go out into the woods anytime and try to get game or whatever. So there are certain things that the free persons could do that certainly the enslaved people couldn't do, but there still was this sense that they really weren't free. James Lee and his mother and grandmother were not going to leave Della Plain. The reason, if they left Della Plain and they went to an area where whites didn't know that they were free, just because they had this piece of paper, they didn't have to honor it. They could then put them into the jail and have them sold, and that person could, keep the money. So there are a lot of things. Whether the impressed free people of color were treated better than the enslaved, I don't know. It doesn't really say. The problem is with a lot of the slave narratives or the free persons of color narratives is you don't have a lot of their written word. If you look at the 1860 census, both James and Charles say that they were not able to read or write. That is because after Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, the law was you do not teach any free person or enslaved person to read or write. By 1860, there was over 98% of all enslaved persons that obtained their manumission were illiterate. So you don't have a lot of writings about how they were treated, what they got in compensation. The one area that we do have a lot of documentation is the federal papers. In the 1930s, President Roosevelt, through the Writers' Works Project, sent people out to talk to those elderly people who had been enslaved before the Civil War. And they give us context of what life was like as an enslaved person. The free people of color, there's not a whole lot of oral history about them too, because they really don't want to talk about it. And I would ask my grandfather, what more do we know about James Lee? And he's like, he really didn't want to talk about it. It's almost like they just wanted to move forward, get land, create schools, great churches, and do what they needed to do. Whether they were treated differently when they were digging the entrenchments, I couldn't tell you. The bottom line is they both had to do it though, whether you were enslaved or you were free. You didn't have a choice.
If anybody has any other questions, please go ahead and open your mics and feel free to ask. Just as a follow-up, I see that they stayed in Virginia. I guess they were born and raised there, and they moved from Della Plain to Falls Church. But they stayed in Virginia, which was Confederate territory, but maybe Falls Church was a little bit better off than Della Plain.
Falls Church was a little different. Even during the Civil War, the Falls Church had the first integrated home militia. So they had both black and white that were guarding against Mosby Raiders coming into the City of Falls Church. So that in itself is telling, to the point where maybe they were a little bit more progressive. After the Civil War, many Blacks owned grocery stores and things of that nature, and they would be on the main street in the City of Falls Church, not on the back alley. So there was a lot of, I think, intermixing with the races for a while. Now, when you get closer to the 1920s, things kind of change and segregation really starts hitting that area. But before then, it was a little bit more progressive.
Fascinating.
Certainly more than I would think Della played.
Definitely, if you could send us any links, we can post them on our website of to the archives of the audio recordings that you did. That would be wonderful. And if maybe we can wrap this up by hearing a little bit about your work that you're doing now to write a memoir.
I am writing the memoir. It's the name of the book is Finding Raymond, and it speaks to how I grew up in a African-American community and not looking like anyone. You know, I'm fairer than anyone. My hair is longer. My speech is different, and thinking that there was something absolutely wrong with me. It's like, well, what's going on? Why am I so different from the other Black kids that are living in my community? Because it's segregated. We're all living in the same Black communities and going to the same churches. So once I found my biological father, I could fit pieces together and learn about a part of my family that I never knew. And if I hadn't have taken the initiative to find it, that history, it would have been lost to me. So I wanted to write a book to really inspire folks to go out and talk to their elders and get oral histories and learn about who they are, research and understand, because it's important. It didn't matter to me if I was Black or white. What mattered to me is that I was me. And so me happened to be Black and white. And so I had to have that truth. And so I'm hoping that that truth will help other people that are searching for, you know, who they are. Because it was rough being a mixed race child back in the 50s. I mean, it was rough. There was segregation on the white side and there was segregation on the Black side. So I was kind of caught in the middle. So it's cathartic to really be able to put this on paper. And I think there will be other people that understand what it's like. The other that I'm writing is part of my dissertation. I'm really interested in the land ownership and creating community through schools and churches after the Civil War and Reconstruction. Because I was born in Fairfax, Virginia, and Mike, my husband, was born in Fairfax, South Carolina. And so the difference between our families are like night and day, to the point where in Northern Virginia, I think it was easier for African Americans to purchase land than it was if you go into South Carolina, Georgia, or Louisiana. Mike's people were not sharecroppers, but if you go lower down to the lower parts of the South, that's where you see a lot of African Americans sharecropping. They're getting caught in these laundering laws and being used as chain gangs. But in Northern Virginia, there seemed to be a chance for African Americans to obtain land. And when they obtained that land, they were able to grow crops to feed their family. And then they were so close to Washington, D.C., there was a commerce. They could take that extra produce, take it to Liberty Market in D.C., sell it, and then have money to bring back to the community to create churches and schools and the things of that nature. So that's a story that I really want to tell about Northern Virginia because, you know, honestly, a lot of people will say, when I say I'm a seventh generation Northern Virginian, they're like, wait a minute, people have been here for 7 generations. I mean, it's so transient because, we're so close to DC, the politics, the consulting with the Defense Department, so on and so forth, the military. But there's this undercurrent of folks who've been here forever. And I don't want to lose that narrative. And so that goes back to my mantra of, I want to give voice to those who had no voice. And so that's what I'm going to try to do in that book.
Dave Stewart, just add one thing. I want to say to Marion, I really thought that it was extremely interesting. I happen to have a personal interest in genealogy, but I think even for people who don't, it was fascinating, a wonderful presentation. I think I have 2 comments. One, I wonder whether the African-American Museum, the Smithsonian's African-American Museum would have anything remotely like this, because this is really interesting stuff. Fascinating.
Yes.
Second point is that I would think that there might be some records that if the Confederates compensated these free African Americans, which I doubt, I think that would be revealed in the records. But my bet would be that they were badly mistreated and weren't compensated.
Yeah.
But I would hope somebody could be able to research that at some point and pin that down, because this is a fascinating story. This is
most people don't know about the impressments. And when you go to the historic site, this historic Centerville, there's no mention of the African Americans who helped dig those entrenchments.
Yeah.
So,
this is an untold story, except you're telling it, and it's great. I really
you better believe
really
I'm going to go back and say, look, we got to redo this narrative. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. And as far as the Smithsonian goes, the interim director of that museum is Spencer Crew, and he is my mentor in the PhD program. So, he inspires me to do a lot of this research and talking. So.
That's good. I see a question from Bill, but I'll just add that if they had been compensated, somebody's already pointed it out, it would have been in Confederate currency, which would have been valueless.
Right.
Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, Marion, thank you very much. This is a great presentation. I've been working with the Alexandria Slave Museum and that effort, and I'd like to get together with you and talk further, because I think it's more than just a city museum. I see it as something that is reflective of a national story about the African, the domestic slave trade, and which goes much further than Alexandria, but goes all the way down through Virginia and Tennessee and into Mississippi. And that story needs to be told. And I have some ideas of how to do that, and I'd like to talk to you about that if you're interested.
Absolutely, very interesting.
Just want to thank you very much, Marion, for joining us. Just a wonderful, wonderful presentation.